Welcome to Taking Stock 68. My father was a man of mystery. Although I know he spent much of his childhood and early adult life in the care or service of the Royal Navy, as a child I didn't know anything about his background or family, if he had one. And I had no idea until fairly recently where he lived or went to school. What I did know as a child was that my dad worked in the London docks as a tally clerk. I went off to work 6 days a week, very early in the morning, with a packed lunch and, in winter, a tin of hand-rolled cigarettes which he'd made the night before, because in the exposed environs of the Royal Docks on the River Thames in winter-time, the bitter weather made it too cold and too windy for him to roll them at the time. Whatever the weather though, there was always a ritual when he came home from work. He would hang his various coats and scarves up in the cupboard, take off his thick shoes and put on his slippers, loosen but never remove his necktie, sit himself in a chair beside the scullery fire and call us children to him. He would always say, "What have you been doing today?" And each of the three of us would tell him in our own way. When it was my turn, as a small child, I would stand on his feet and hold his hands and babble out every exciting or boring thing that had happened that day at school, as most children will. And when eventually I paused for breath, no change there then, my dad, who had been listening with rapt attention, would smile and say, "And still they gazed, and still the wonder grew that one small head could carry all he knew." As far as I was concerned, it was just something that my dad said, one of his many sayings. I didn't know then, and it was many years before I did know, that my father, the ex-Navy petty officer, my father the dock worker, was quoting the 18th century poet Oliver Goldsmith in his poem The Deserted Village. Nor did I realise, a few years later, when I was a late teenager, as we stood outside in the garden in the summer gloaming, listening to the birds piping one last time as they came in to roost in our apple tree, that when he said, "Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while you are pouring forth your soul abroad in such an ecstasy," he wasn't making it up as he went along. He was pretty much quoting John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale without the these and thous. Where did he learn that, I wondered, when I discovered these and other literary gems that had been casually let loose by my father during the course of my childhood? The answer is, honestly, that I didn't know then and I don't know now. He never attributed what turned out to be quotations, and I don't recall seeing him sitting in the scullery on a Sunday after dinner with the Oxford Book of English Verse clutched in his grip. The Daily Express possibly, but certainly not the collected works of 19th century romantic poets. I wish he was here for me to ask him, but he isn't. I said right from the beginning that he was a man of mystery, and to a large extent that he remained until the day he died, when I was 33, 30 years ago. I've slowly come to the conclusion, though, that perhaps my dad wasn't so unusual in his ability to quote from long-dead poets. My mother could do the same with hymns and Bible passages, which was unsurprising after we discovered among her possessions, after she died, a leather-bound authorised version of the Bible inscribed with something like "The gift of the estate of Philip Lord Wharton," and was shown to be a prize given to children who managed successfully to memorise and recite a number of psalms and a passage or two from the Gospels in public. My late sister and I continued the tradition of the memorisation and public recitation of poetry, and my brother and I only recently were chortling over a rediscovered poem which our sister had had to recite at school and had practised in our scullery in front of the whole family to great hilarity. And it warms my heart to know that my eldest granddaughter Amber loves to do exactly the same thing now, so the family performing gene is strong in her. The thing is, every family, I guess, has stories, traditions, sayings which are unique to that family and may even be incomprehensible to anyone outside the family. My wife's family, being at least half Danish, maintained a tradition to the day my mother-in-law died of singing a traditional Danish celebration song around the dining room table at birthdays and Christmas time. I wasn't even sure it wasn't completely made up until I saw Sophie Graubu sing exactly the same thing with her family in an episode of the Scandi noir drama The Killing. But there it was, And there it still is occasionally in our family, a hand-me-down tradition for my 1/8 Danish kids. Such things, such memories are important enough to maintain. It's many years since I stood in the garden and heard my father recite part of Ode to a Nightingale with no artifice, no shame and no explanation. It's a shorter length of time since I stood in another garden in a late spring dusk with other members of my choir as we gave an unrehearsed and impromptu performance of All in the April Evening while at an after-show party, a performance which had our choir master's neighbours in houses all around coming out into their gardens to listen and to applaud at the end. It's similar memories which bind people together not just at the level of families but at the level of communities as well. Village communities, town communities and faith communities cannot come together to celebrate or to support each other unless they can come together to share and create memories. Communities and faiths are built on the foundations of memory, and such memories need to be recited and repeated like poetry until they become, like poetry, ingrained into our psyche and allow us to move on, to make more and bind us closer together. Common experiences, common literature build recognition and connection. Last year, pre-lockdown, I was doing a volunteer stint at the Lettering Arts Centre in Snape, and I was helping move some carved stones from the shop into the back of the vehicle owned by the letter carver who I met for the first time. I can't remember why, but she had to give me her business card, and when I saw the name of her house, I recognised it as the first few words of a poem by George Herbert, and to her delight and astonishment, I managed unprompted to recite the whole poem. It made a connection between two strangers and a bridge for friendship and another memory. When the history of this strange year of 2020 is written, I hope that in the midst of the tragedy and the terror of the pandemic, we'll find common memories, not in the selfishness of the few, but in the grace and fortitude of the many. That it will not be the names and titles of the self-serving and the selfish politicians which will be emblazoned on the walls of new hospitals and schools, but the names of those who risked and lost their lives in the service of their fellow human beings, and those who used every scientific and medical skill to shine some light on the future. I hope they are the names and the stories which will be emblazoned on the memorials and remembered in story and song and poetry. When we come together again to worship, as we will, when we come together again to share the communal experience of theatre or concert, as we will, when we gather in thousands round sports fields and stadiums to share the adrenaline rush of supporting our sporting heroes, as we will, I hope and pray that we'll remember with gratitude not just the heroes of our parents' generation, but the so far uncelebrated lives of those who will make it possible for us once more to come together to make the memories which future generations will treasure, as much as I treasure those few scraps of lines of poetry which bring back to me, in my mind's eye, my father's smiling face as he recited Oliver Goldsmith to an oblivious 5-year-old me. Stay safe, people.